Hi everybody, it's Courtney. I'm back here with another design team project for Not Too Shabby. Today I'm going to be using one of the new stamp sets from the newest release from Not Too Shabby called Happy Halloween, and it's got these cute little witches in there. And I'm going to be building a mini scene here. I know I usually create full-blown scenes that take up the entire card panel, and that can be a little intimidating. So we're going to start off kind of small here. So you can see that I have my mask cut for all of the images that I plan on using. I am going to be stamping all of the images with blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. And I'm stamping and masking all of my images front to back. So any object that you want to be in front of another, you want to stamp and mask that first, then move on to the next image. So my little standing witch here is going to be holding her broom and be standing in front of this cauldron that has these cute little witch's legs hanging out of it, or hanging on from the middle of it, I guess. So I'm going to stamp the standing witch first, mask her, and then stamp the cauldron. I'm also masking the cauldron because I'm also going to be doing some ink blending with Distress Oxide inks to create my scene or to create my background. But we're not taking up the entire card here, so this is going to be more of a clean and simple card. So once all of my images were masked out, I am going to be using 3 different Distress Oxides here. I'm using Tea Dye, Vintage Photo, and Pumice Stone. I'm also using the Brick Stencil by Tim Holtz. I have a piece of Eclipse masking paper here, and I'm just going to kind of cut this at an angle just so that it's not a complete straight line. You can certainly just use a straight line with Post-it note tape or washi tape or however you want to do it, but I just figured that this would add a little bit something extra. I'm using some blending brushes by Trinity Stamps to just lay a very, very light layer of that tea dye down so I don't have a completely white background. Going to tape this down, tape the stencil down with some Post-it note tape, going in with the Vintage Photo, and I'm going right in the center. I'm not extending the darker color very far at all. I want the middle to be darker, and I want it to kind of fade off to white. So once I have the Vintage Photo down, I'm going to move on to that tea dye and kind of just let that fade to white. Now I do have a completely straight line off there to the left-hand side, but I'll fix that in just a minute. I'm going to take the other piece of the Eclipse masking paper that I cut at an angle, so you're going to need both pieces here, and I'm just going to add a little bit of that pumice stone to the bottom. Again, just concentrating the darkest area, the most ink, being very close to the mask and kind of fading out to white. So in order to fix this straight line that I have going on there where the stencil actually ended, I'm going to go back in with my Blending Buddy brush, but not add any more ink. So I'm just going to soften that edge out a little bit. Being the Distress Oxides kind of lay on top of the paper, you still have a few minutes to kind of spread that ink out a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and remove my masks and move on to the Copic coloring, which I kept fairly simple. I pretty much used the same color combinations for all of the images. Going to start off with her skin tones here. I start off with the lightest color to get the paper saturated, then going in with the darkest color and just adding just a teeny tiny bit of that where her hair is hanging over her face and also on the inside of her arms there. Blending that out with the 2 mid-tone colors, and then I'll move back in with that lightest color just for that highlight area. Now she's got little circles on her cheeks for, I guess, where her little rosy cheeks would be. I went in with an R20. It wasn't quite dark enough, so I brought in an R21 for that. For her hair, I want her hair to appear black, so I'm going to start off with the 100 marker, which is the black marker. I'm just using the very tip of my marker to create my shadows here, which will be underneath where her hat is and also on the very tips of her hair. I'm just using some flicking motions here. You can see that my marker is straight up and down, and I'm kind of, each flick is a little bit different in size. So some of them are a little bit longer than others, and that's how you'll get your texture. Going to do the same thing with the C7 and the C5, and the C5 is actually my lightest color, and you'll see that I'm leaving a little bit of white here, and this will just make it appear as if her hair is very shiny. So you can always leave some white space if you don't have a lot of markers, or if you want to add some extra texture, I guess you could say. So moving on to the purple combination here, going to start off with her witch's hat. Again, starting off with that lightest color to map out the darkest areas and also to get the paper saturated. Then going in with that darkest color. Now for the inside of her hat, I guess you could say, I'm kind of reserving that to be the very darkest. Now this would be more of a rounder object, so I'm going to keep a center highlight here, but you can see on the, I guess it would be like the brim of her hat, I'm leaving a little bit of white space as I go in with my darkest color and my darkest midtone, because I don't want those two darkest areas to touch, or else you're not going to be able to tell the difference between the two. Once I get to the lightest midtone, I'm going to go ahead and fill in that white area, and this will kind of differentiate between the inside of the hat and the brim of the hat. Going to fill that in with my lightest color, and I had some harsh lines on the top portion of her hat, so I'm going to bring in that V15 just to kind of soften that up just a little bit. For every other stripe on her little stockings here, I'm going to use the purple. Same thing for this witch's legs here coming out of the cauldron. I'm just going in with the darkest color and adding one little line on either side of her legs, because again, round object, center highlight. Going in with the darkest midtone, and I'm skipping the lightest midtone here because I want to keep that contrast, and these areas are very teeny tiny. So I'm just filling that in with the lightest color for that highlight. Next, we are going to move on to her, oh no, first I did her belt. Her belt and the little cuffs on her sleeves there. Again, going in with the same purple combination that I used for the stockings and the hat. Again, just concentrating a center highlight. You definitely don't have to use all of these colors here. These are pretty teeny tiny areas, but I was just trying to keep everything a little bit consistent. So now I'm going to bring out some gray and black markers, pretty much the same as I used for her hair, except I'm bringing in the C3 now. For the band or belt, no, I guess it's not a belt, but whatever's around her hat there, I'm going to be adding some shading on either side. For her dress, I'm going to add a little bit more shading to her sleeves, being her arms are a little bit behind her. And for her shoes, I'm just doing the inside of her shoes and closer to the bottom portion. I guess the soles of the shoes would be a little bit darker. I'm just extending those areas out a little bit with the C7 and C5, which are the same colors that I used for her hair. And for the highlight, I'm bringing in a little bit lighter for the C3 so that I can really get that contrast. The scary dark colors that I talk about, it's just as important to add that scary light color so that you really get that contrast. Now for the top portion of her dress, I felt like I wasn't quite getting enough, so I added a little bit of C7 and blended that out a little bit with the C5 and C3, and I like that much better. So next I'm going to bring in some green markers here, and this will be for the little heart on her belt, for every other stripe on their stockings, and for this little buckle that is part of her hat. Now right now I'm only using 3 colors because these are pretty teeny tiny areas, and as long as they're far apart, or at least somewhat far apart, you'll still get that contrast. Same thing for every other stripe for her stockings. Again, just going in with one little teeny tiny line with that scary dark color, blending that out a little bit, or actually I'm not even blending, I'm just putting a line here. You don't have to do much blending in these teeny tiny areas. And then finishing off with the lightest color. So next, for the stars that are on the cauldron, I'm going to use the same green combination here, but my shading is going to depend on where the star is. So being the cauldron is a round object, I want to keep that center highlight. So the 2 stars that are on either edge are going to be a little bit darker than the 2 in the middle. Not much, but a little bit. I'm still adding all 4 colors to all 4 stars, but the ones in the center are going to have a little bit more of the highlight color and a little bit less of the scary dark color. I want my cauldron to be black, so I'm going to use that same black and gray combination that I used for her dress. And again, round object, keeping that center highlight. Now, you'll have to work around the stars. So it can be a little bit difficult and a little bit scary, but keep in mind you always have a white gel pen and a colorless blender to fix any errors that you may make. So again, keeping that center highlight, also coloring the shoes for this other witch's feet here. And now for the top portion of the cauldron, that's gonna create a little bit of a shadow on the cauldron part itself. I guess it would be like the lip of it. And you can see I'm adding a little bit of shading coming from either side on that, but I'm keeping that white edge on the very bottom of that lip. Again, I don't want that to blend in with the shadow that it's creating, so that you can differentiate between the two. Once I get to that lightest mid-tone color, which is the C5, I can go ahead and fill that white line in. This is not a necessity, but it will kind of boost up your contrast just a little bit. So I'm going to finish off with that C3 for that highlight color just there in the center and on the toe portion of her one little shoe there that's not behind the other witch. Going to bring in some E50 markers for the broom, going in right with that darkest color, only using 3 colors here. There's not a huge area to work with, just using some feathering motions for the broom part itself and for the handle. Typically it would have a center highlight, but there just wasn't enough room to add it, so I just added a little bit of shading to the left hand side. For the little, I guess it would be the metal part of the broom part, I'm just going to add some black and some gray and do the same thing for this star as well as I did for the others. Last, we have the bubbles in the cauldron itself, and quite honestly, you're probably not going to tell once I add the detail later, but I did want to add just a little bit of color to these. So I'm bringing out a W5 marker, and I'm kind of just adding a little bit of a shadow where one bubble is laying behind another, and also adding like a little flick line kind of towards one side of each of the bubbles, and then blending that out a little bit with the W1, and then very quickly over the entire area, going over it with my colorless blender to kind of get these colors to mesh a little bit. Once all my coloring was done, I'm going to bring out my white gel pen and add some highlights to various different areas, kind of everywhere. And this will kind of boost up your coloring as well and add, or appear to add, even more contrast than we already have. So once all of that was complete, I'm going to go ahead and add some sparkle with the Nuvo Aqua Shimmer Pen over the little bubbles there, as well as some of the stars and the belt or band on her hat. Going to go ahead and line up 2 of the sentiments from the stamp set using my grid mat or my work surface here to make sure that they're straight. Pop those onto an acrylic block, and I'm stamping with black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. I did stamp this on a scrap piece of paper just to make sure that the 2 sentiments at least appeared to be straight before stamping that onto my card panel. I don't know whether I mentioned, but the card panel itself is 1/4 of an inch shorter than an A2 size card. So it is 5 1/4 by 4, using some double-sided foam or double-sided adhesive foam here by Sizzix to go ahead and apply this to my A2 size note card. This stuff is super sticky, so make sure that you do have it in the position that you want it before actually sticking it down to your card panel, or card base, because once it's down, you're not going to be able to move it. So last, I finished off with some Nuvo glitter drops here, and these are the clear ones, just to go over those bubbles to add a little bit of texture and even more shimmer. And that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I'll leave the supplies listed below, and do not forget about your discount code to the Not Too Shabby shop. Thanks, guys. Bye.